What's up everybody, Ajax here, welcome to the channel and the first episode of Ajax Thinks. But before we get into the topic of today's video, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context. You know, we don't know each other. Let me talk at you for a little bit. Because this is my first video, I just want to give you a little bit of background as to my perspective of VR. It does pertain to the video, however, if you just want to jump straight into the topic listed in the title, feel free to jump ahead to this timestamp. In April of this year, I got it into my head that I wanted to experience the hype that is Half-Life Alyx. Having been a console gamer pretty much my entire life, I had nothing in my inventory that would help me along with this goal. I had to start from scratch and I knew nothing of the VR realm. I had no idea what type of headset I would need or if there were even multiple headsets on the market. I didn't know whether I would need a VR-ready PC rig, any of that. After admittedly minimal and definitely impulsive research, I decided that the Oculus Quest was going to be the best option because it was a standalone headset that did not require a PC rig. After a quick Google search of can you play Half-Life Alyx on the Oculus Quest and discovering that the answer was yes, I went ahead and pulled the trigger. Now, this was early in the pandemic, maybe April of 2020. The Oculus Quest was sold out on the Oculus store. The only place you could find it was on Amazon or eBay. And of course it was marked up, but at this point I didn't really care. I wanted to play VR and I wanted to play it now. I purchased the 128GB on rush delivery for just under $700 after tax and priority shipping. Now, one of the very first things I did with my brand new Half-Life Alyx machine was discover that I could not play Half-Life Alyx. Well, at least not without a VR-ready PC rig and this thing called SideQuest that has a special version of a program called Virtual Desktop, but it was a mess. It was a mess. The silver lining is, at this moment, hey, at least I had VR at my fingertips. So, I don't know, maybe 30 days and $3,000 later, I had myself a little gaming station with the PC finally, fully dedicated to VR. After having suited up to play the most immersive VR experience to date, I was left with what seemed like limitless VR potential. I now had a standalone VR headset with which I could play Rift and Steam VR games completely wirelessly at that. Now, I know the hardware in the Quest was inferior to every other PC VR at the time, but to me, the immersion of being untethered was well worth the lower field of vision, frame rate, and tracking capabilities. And not to mention, the comfort and battery issues of the Oculus Quest were very easily fixable, well, with the use of more money, which at this point clearly didn't matter to me. So after having spent about 5 months moonlighting and, well, honestly daylighting as a vast assortment of VR avatars, imagine my surprise when the Quest 2 arrives in all of its Snapdragon glory. Well, maybe not surprise. I was listening to the VR community. I had my ear to the ground. I did hear the hype about it from a mile away, but still. Now, with the Quest 2, I have a standalone headset that plays PC VR better than Oculus's previous PC VR headset for only $299. Okay, $399. Alright, well maybe more like $650, but shh. All of this to say that my experience with VR has been one of a unique perspective. My passion has rooted itself into my core conversation, and this has influenced a few friends of my own to buy their headsets. But as the months ticked by, I started to notice fewer and fewer of them playing consistently. I became disheartened. I found myself trying to pull them back to VR, but I was only greeted by this inexplicable resistance. At first, I was upset. I was miles away from understanding why, and none of them could articulate why their passion for VR had waned. After having considered how gung-ho, excited, and expensive my journey into VR was, I realized that it might have a stronger grip on me than, say, the average consumer. Once I had shed some light on one of my potential biases, I was able to somewhat view VR from a more general perspective, which is what inspired the topic of today's video. The fundamental differences between traditional gaming and virtual reality gaming. But to understand the differences, we gotta first identify what games aim to do. Now, the purpose of video games is a controversial and infinitely complex topic, so for the sake of brevity, I'm going to look at the differences between these two gaming aspects strictly from a stimulation standpoint. For me, and I imagine most gamers, immersion plays a very important role in a video game by providing the main source of stimulation, especially in the adventure, action, and RPG genres. At this point, I believe that VR clearly wins in this category, providing both 360-degree audible and visual stimulation. However, I do think it's important to note that from a sensory perspective, both traditional and VR gaming check only 2 of the 5 sensory boxes. 360-degree audible stimulation in traditional gaming has been around for a long time now, and if you're like me, you've taken it for granted, and especially how immersive it can be. I've had a few jump scares that I will never forget while playing Subnautica that were purely audible. So again, from a sensory perspective, traditional gaming and virtual reality gaming technically are on the same playing field, stimulating only 2 of the 5 senses, sight and sound. Now, until haptic feedback options for VR become a more viable option for consumers, I am going to exclude the sensation of touch in VR because the vibrations and feedback experienced in VR is essentially the same thing you get in, say, a console controller, minus, of course, the visual component of actually interacting with your environment. I would say that it's commonly known that VR has a pretty low retention rate. Past trends dictate that headsets slowly begin to collect more and more dust in between uses. I personally have found this to be the case with multiple friends, one of whose enthusiasm showed no bounds as she ordered her Oculus Quest 1 from my living room couch, her face still sweaty from her first Beat Saber session. At the end of the day, for some people, the novelty of 360-degree visual immersion wears thin, and what you are simply left with is audible and visual stimulation. I believe this to be virtual reality's biggest hindering factor at the moment. Most people would argue that it's the inconvenience of VR, things such as the requirement of a play space, a well-lit area, relatively no disturbance around you, standing or moving for long periods of time. But I think that if you were to provide the player with the correct level of sensory immersion, all of these inconveniences become merely requisites for the experience. The easiest way to justify my logic here is to remind you that people will stand in line for hours waiting for, 90 seconds of stimulation from a roller coaster. Another source of stimulation in video games comes from what I refer to as microtask satisfaction. In the world of traditional gaming, developers have found ways for the gamer to derive a sense of pleasure from a menial and oftentimes painfully repetitive but necessary task. Inventory/storage management is a great example of this. In VR games like Half-Life Alyx, the storage system is limited to your guns and ammo plus 2 inventory slots on your wrist. It's pretty hard to think of another game with such limited storage, but the system fits the immersion level of the game. Sure, there were plenty of times where I thought maybe I could carry an extra healing item or an extra grenade, but because of how visually immersed I was, having only 2 wrists was a perfectly acceptable reason for not being able to do so. I'm sure that having such limited storage in a linear first-person shooter on a traditional gaming platform would have been unacceptable for me. It's pretty hard to immerse me that much to allow such little stimulation from the actual game. You know, if you're not using items, what are you doing? You're just moving and shooting. It's obviously more complicated than that, but I don't know. In traditional gaming, the measurement of inventory capacity is usually indicated by an item weight with an overall carrying capacity or some arbitrary number of inventory slots. If I was playing a game like Half-Life Alyx on a traditional platform and I opened up my inventory to find only 2 slots, I would probably be a little annoyed. In traditional gaming, inventory management is tedious, it's daunting, relentless, but it's impossibly satisfying. And unfortunately, that kind of takes a hit in VR. Conversely, in other VR games like The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, you're given a backpack with a determined number of slots that you can use to pick up loot and other salvageable items throughout the world. Don't get me wrong, I love this aspect of the game, but I will say that sense of satisfaction derived from managing these items is just not as strong in VR as it is on console or PC. This could be simply that clicking and dragging with the mouse on a confined screen is always going to be faster than physically grabbing them, placing them down to grab another item because your backpack is in your other hand, then picking up your first item again just to switch the location in your storage. But in traditional gaming, my storage or inventory is already out of sight, and therefore out of mind. Games throughout the years have taught me that it's perfectly reasonable to pick up this ridiculous item and store it in my imaginary backpack. Now, in VR, this does create sort of like this ironically immersive moment where you could technically pull out all of your items from your backpack and put them on like a table and completely rearrange it, kind of like how you would do in real life. But at the end of the day, once you've done that, you kind of realize you just put 12 rubber shoes, 13 logs, 3 broken rifle stocks, an axe, and a shotgun all in your Mary Poppins bag. In traditional gaming, I don't really care how big the item is. I have no problem conceptualizing how one would fit this ginormous item into this even larger imaginary storage. But video games have been played on a two-dimensional flat screen since their conception, and these development teams have a far greater sample size of data regarding the ergonomics and basic quality of life in their games. I mean, in VR, when you don't technically have borders on your screen, how do you decide to lay out your UI? I mean, to work around this, most VR games will give the players some sort of real-life item, like a journal or a tablet, on which they can lay their UI out because it does have a screen. But where does the player store it? Do they store it on their chest, over their shoulder? Do you just suck it up and make a pause button and link it in that menu? These questions, they're all ones that don't have a standard answer yet. My point is, over the years, how many gaming aspects have been ironed out through trial and error and have become sort of an accepted industry standard? The best example of this is anyone tried to go back and play GoldenEye for the N64 recently. I remember being so good at that game, but I went back and tried to play a first-person shooter with one joystick, and I gotta say, that is absolute lunacy. Nowadays, people are forced to create solutions for what was once the accepted way of life. But I think one of the most overlooked differences between flat screen and VR gaming is the hand-eye coordination requirements. Let's face it, this is one of the best arguments for the productivity and usefulness of video games. Most games, with the exception of a few genres like RTS and turn-based strategy types, require some level of agility. Flat screen gaming focuses heavily on the mental agility aspect. The ability to think and understand quickly, combined with a little hand-eye coordination, can give a player the roots to become competitive in the realm of flat screen gaming. However, in virtual reality, that agility requirement is much more physical, bordering athleticism. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be an athlete to be competitive in VR, not by any means, but when you take the concept of reloading and link it to a one-press button, and then reinvent that into grabbing a magazine from your belt, loading the clip, and then charging the weapon, there's always going to be a skill separation that just isn't going to be there in traditional gaming. Some people are going to be able to reload a tenth of a second faster than others, and that's just going to be affected based on their coordination level. Not every single great esports gamer can perform athletic and agility-based tasks like that of their peers. From a competitive side of things, I think that it is clear that due to its application to a wider range of people, traditional gaming is going to be the winner here. But let's take our eye off the leaderboards for a second and explore the differences in social interaction. Social interaction in traditional gaming is a weird topic and certainly varies from person to person. For me, as an introvert, socializing in games was always purely informational. In competitive games, I would only speak for callouts. Very rarely would I meet someone that I would want to friend for any other purpose than their skill at that pertaining game. I understand that that's not like that for everyone, but socializing in VR really brought me out of my shell. There's just something more engaging and lighthearted when you can physically express and represent yourself. At some point, I bet we have all laid in wait for that moment to pull off the silly but perfectly timed emote on console or PC. But in VR, you can do things like this.
High five!
And this.
So many hit points
Trick
on a
shot.
level 50, man. I'm so good.
And sometimes even this. Boo! But right now, with everything going on, when you can't just pack up and go visit friends and family, there is something comforting about being able to just meet up at your local galactic space theater and watch a movie together while being able to throw tomatoes at the screen and popcorn at each other. You can imagine how much more personal the conversation can feel with the addition of simple hand gestures by someone while they speak. I mean, think about VR chat. I mean, it's an entire game based essentially on the social interactivity of VR. But gamers can come in any shape, any size, and any age. But one thing that we all have in common is that when we're gaming, we are all constantly making micro decisions. These are mostly subconscious reactions, but just because you may not be aware of the decision doesn't mean that it wasn't considered and then made. For those of you that have ever driven a long distance in a car and then felt exhausted afterwards, you have these micro decisions to blame. Constantly deciding to straighten or recenter in your lane, or switch lanes, or check your mirrors, speed up or slow down. These decisions weigh on your mental state. Developers have discovered that if they drown the necessary micro decisions in rewards, sometimes as subtle as a simple and pleasing sound, the player doesn't seem to mind all that much. But I will say, after a long day of work, adding the physical requirements to the mental requirements of VR can make it a little unappealing. I do catch myself wanting to have my cake and eat it too by being able to capture the full Population 1 experience while also being able to lay down on my couch like I was playing a console game. But in conclusion, I guess I'm willing to accept that in its current state, virtual reality has not grabbed every single gamer on the planet by now. I can see some of the hang-ups that people may have with it and how traditional gaming may still feel superior in certain ways. Things are a lot smoother, faster paced in traditional gaming, and that's due to how refined it is, and not to mention, it can appeal to and support a wider variety of competitive type gamers. While virtual reality's immersion level is unprecedented for new participants, without the stimulation of at least one new sense, it can gradually lose its ability to inspire awe. But with haptic vests on the way soon at a reasonable price, the next generation of VR might be closer than you think. I guess the important thing is to know that I'm not the only one that is passionate about this VR uprising. There are plenty of enthusiasts out there that have made a voice for themselves and become a source of positive influence for this beloved virtual reality community. I want to thank you if you've stuck with me for this long. I know I can be long-winded, but if you liked the video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my barren YouTube channel. I plan to post plenty more VR gameplay and content in the weeks to come. If you have any suggestions for a topic that you would like for me to explore, I would be happy to consider it. And if you have any questions, thoughts, or criticisms, please leave them in the comments below. That's it for now. Ajax out.